See everyone this morning. We have a lot of folks here. Hello to our visitors. Thank you for being here. We love our freedoms. We love having the ability to do almost anything we want. But then we look at God's Word, and God puts a lot of restrictions on us. There's a lot of statements in the Bible saying, don't do this thing, and instead do that thing. And many people look at that and they say, well, how dare God restrict my personal freedoms? How dare he tell me what I'm allowed to put in my body? How dare he tell me what I'm supposed to do with my time? How dare he tell me who I'm supposed to marry or not marry? And they get upset. And honestly, a lot of the false doctrines we see around the world are because someone said, well, I don't like this restriction God has put on me. But why did he put these restrictions? Well, left unchecked, people do bad things. People hurt other people. There was an interview with a relatively famous atheist where he was basically saying, I don't need some outside instructions telling me what to do to be a good person. And okay, for some people that may hold true. But many people cause harm. And just look at the world. It doesn't take far to look to see people causing harm to people. And so many of the restrictions God has put on his people are intended to protect others. So today, as we're continuing our sermon series, looking at strengths through understanding God's restrictions, we are going to be talking about the social and personal laws in the Jewish law. Last week we talked about the religious laws. This week we're going to talk about the social and personal laws. Now to do this, we're again going to examine the key idea being that these laws are for your good. We're then going to give a broad overview of the categories of the various restrictions, and then we'll take a deeper look at some of those restrictions and see how they were for their good. Now, as I said last week, and I'm going to say again next week, we're studying the old law, but we're not under the old law. These are not laws that we are beholden to follow. We're studying them because they help us to understand God. And when we get into studying the New Testament restrictions and the instructions God has given us, we need to set up that idea that he does this. He sets these laws in place for the good of his people. Now, with that being in our minds, let's re-examine the key idea being that he puts these laws for your good. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 6. We just had that read to us, and we read it last week. Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 20. When your son asks you to come, When your son asks you in the time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean, which the Lord our God commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land in which he had sworn to our forefathers. And then verse 24, so the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is to this day. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before the Lord our God, just as he commanded us. So we see here that God's laws were for their good. He didn't just make laws willy-nilly. He did this for their betterment and also for their survival. We're going to talk more about this in just a moment. But many of the Old Covenant laws kept them safe. Kept them safe from diseases, but also kept them safe from their neighbors. And most importantly, these laws were for their righteousness. The physical side of things is all well and good, but God wants his people to be in a right relationship with him. And so these laws were for their righteousness. And this statement that they were for their good, for their survival, and for their righteousness holds true with all the laws that he gave them. So, with that in mind, let's talk about an overview of the restrictions. Now, let's pause for just a second. I'm using a set of wording that may seem a little bit odd. Why say restrictions? After all, that sounds a little bit, well, harsh, right? We don't like hearing restrictions. Why not say something more palatable like laws or ordinances or instructions? Those are all perfectly good words. And they sound a little bit less harsh than restrictions. Well, I'm using the wording restrictions because we need to understand and accept that God does place restrictions on his people, and that those restrictions are for our good. He does restrict us. In the New Testament, under the new law, there are restrictions on what we can do. And those restrictions aren't because God's a big meanie in the sky, but they are for our good. So if we can get it in our heads that God does restrict us, but that's a good thing, then we will have a better time following those laws. So now let's look at some restrictions in the old law. They had restrictions on their diet. You're probably familiar with some of the kosher laws. They weren't allowed to eat pork, but beyond that, they had restrictions on what kind of shellfish they could eat, what kind of seafood they could eat. They had restrictions on which birds they could eat. They had restrictions on what kind of animals based on whether they had a cloven hoof or a not cloven hoof, and whether they chewed the cud or didn't chew the cud. There were laws that covered all sorts of dietary restrictions. Why? Was God just not wanting to have some flavor experiences? No. We know now that many of the various foods that he restricted are poisonous or carry bacteria or carry a high amount of parasites, all sorts of nasty things that if they were to eat them would shorten their lifespan. So this set of dietary laws were for their survival, even though they didn't necessarily understand the science behind it at that time. There were restrictions on hygiene. And when you dig into the hygiene laws, some of them seem a little excessive. There were rules about washing after touching a dead body. That makes sense. There were laws about washing before handling food, laws about what a woman was supposed to do about her menstrual cycle, laws about what you were to do if you had a bodily discharge of various types, or an open sore of various types, or if you got blood on something. Again, they may not have understood the science behind it, but now we understand that those things were keeping them safe, keeping them healthy, because it was helping them to avoid germs and bacteria and infections. There were restrictions on clothing, what men could wear, what women could wear, not mixing two different types of cloths. There were restrictions on tattoos, which we're going to talk more about in a few minutes. There were restrictions on sexuality. We're not talking about this one today, but heads up, we're covering that next week. I decided to add one more old law sermon to this series, and we're going to put all the more controversial and socially sensitive subjects in one sermon so we can handle them all at one time, namely slavery, marriage, and sexuality. So heads up, that's what we're talking about next week. There were restrictions on marriage, who they could and couldn't marry. There were restrictions on the harvest. We're going to talk more about these in just a minute. There were restrictions on punishments, what punishments you could hand out for which crimes, how many lashes you could give someone, how many strikes you could deal out. There were restrictions on animal use. You couldn't work a ox and a donkey under the same yoke, and various other animal uses. There were laws for property use. And we're going to talk more about the property use in a few minutes. There were restrictions about how to treat the poor, how to treat slaves, and the list could go on and on. Now we look at this, and that's a lot of restrictions. And that's just categories of restrictions. But as we look at these, each of those were for their good. Each of them were for their betterment. Now, they may not have understood that at the time. And this is something I want us to get well seated in our minds. They may not have understood how these laws were for their good. But God said they are for your good. Like the science behind the diet and hygiene. they wouldn't have understood about bacteria and things of that nature. But if they followed those laws, they would get the benefits. We may not always understand why God put a restriction on us, but he did, and so it's for our good. Well, it's all well and good for the preacher man to say that these things are for their good, but let's look at these in greater detail. How were these for their good? And what I've done, I've chosen two chapters. We're going to be looking at Leviticus 19 and Leviticus 25, and looking at the various laws in there and how they were for their good. And I chose chapters 19 and chapter 25 because they give a wide range of instructions that we can look at in a relatively short time frame and grasp. Now, we are going to skip over a couple of spots that we're going to deal with next week, but let's turn to Leviticus 19 and see what we have here. Verses 1 through 9 deal with idolatry, which we talked about last week. And then verses 9 and 10, we see restrictions on harvest. Read with me. Leviticus 19, starting in verse 9. Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyards, nor shall you gather all the fallen fruits of your vineyards. You shall leave them for the needy and for the strangers. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so the term gleanings would be the little bits that are left over after the initial harvest. The workers would come through, they would gather up the vast majority of the produce, but there'd always be some little bits left over. And of course, the stuff that falls on the ground and things like that. He says, don't pick those up. Don't harvest those. In fact, the corners of the land, don't harvest those. Let the poor come and gather those bits of food. Now, someone looking at this, especially someone from a modern standpoint, might say, wait, the landowner worked hard for that produce. They should get all the product from the harvest. I mean, after all, it's their land. It's their labor. It's their laborers. They're paying the laborers. Why not get every penny out of that? And when you look at modern finance and stuff, that's the way that companies operate, right? Every penny, every half a penny is important to them. So why leave good produce for the poor to just come and take for free? Well, how was this restriction for their good? Well, they ensured that the poor and helpless are taken care of. We have a great example of how this worked in the book of Ruth, where Ruth came and she gleaned after the harvest. Now you notice something about this. This is a way to take care of the poor, but you notice the landowners aren't told, gather up those gleanings, go find the poor and give it to them. You leave them and the poor have to come collect them themselves. They still have to get up and do the work. But it's providing an opportunity for the poor and the helpless to be taken care of. Okay, so even though the landowner may not benefit from that, the society, the culture, the area around does benefit from it. Continuing on, verses 11 through 18, we see some restrictions on the treatment of others. Let's go through these, and we'll discuss some of them as we go through. Starting in verse 11, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. These sound familiar, right? These are rewordings of some of the 10 commandments and laws that we're very familiar with. Goes on and says, you shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. Now, this is culturally significantly different than what we do. You know, we might get paid on a weekly or bi-weekly or monthly basis, but they didn't have that. They would get paid the day they did the work. You do the work, in the evening, the landowner pays you. Why? Well, that would keep the workers from getting stiffed by the landowner. You can imagine that if they're supposed to work 6 days out of the week, but someone only shows up for 3 days, the landowner might say, you know what, you didn't finish all your hours, you're not getting paid. But this way, they get the pay for their work. And then they can go home and they can go buy food in the market, because very often they were living paycheck to paycheck, as in day to day for their daily food. Goes on and says, verse 14, you shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. So not causing problems for those who are handicapped. A blind or deaf person, not causing problems for them. That doesn't protect you, that protects them. It puts a restriction on your actions for their good. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. So in cases of judgment, not being partial based on someone's socioeconomic position. That's a pretty important rule. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor. You shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Again, that sounds pretty familiar, right? Some of these are repeated again in the New Testament. So we have restrictions on the treatment of others, restricting the way that you can treat those around you. Now, someone might say, oh, come on. Some people deserve harsh treatment. You don't know what they've done to me. You don't know how bad they are. In fact, I've been told that by Christians before. They deserve the bad treatment they're getting. Well, they might. They might deserve it. So why are these restrictions for their good? Well, they keep people from mistreating others or taking justice into their own hands. It's to protect everyone else. Now, I want us to think about that just for a second. A lot of these laws protect others from us. You switch it around a little bit, right? We don't like thinking about ourselves as persons who might be causing harm. But each of these laws are restricting your personal freedoms, or not yours, their personal freedoms. Well, because an individual may end up doing something that causes harm to others. And so this protects them from, well, the person who's receiving the command. That's rather interesting. Now, the next few verses, we're going to skip over and we'll talk about next week. And then we get to verse 26 through 31. And we see some restrictions on personal spiritualism. Let's read this. Starting verse 26. You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination or soothsaying. So divination and soothsaying would be basically trying to tell the future. This would be like modern day tarot cards or, palm readings or tea leaf readings or reading of bones in a bowl, trying to tell the future through soothsaying. You shall not round off the side growth of your head, nor harm the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. Okay, now, many people who are opponents of the Bible have pointed at this and said, see, the Bible says not to trim your beard or get tattoos. It's unreasonable. But why do these particular laws exist here? Well, we have to remember the culture that these were written in. Those things, the cutting the hair in very particular ways, the self-harm, and the tattoos were all marks of idolatry. People would tattoo the mark of their god on their bodies to show their allegiance to that particular idolatrous worship. They would trim their hair in particular ways to show that they belong to a certain cult. The marks on the body, remember the priest of Baal, when they were trying to get Baal to light the offering on fire, and they were yelling and dancing and cutting themselves. There are various reasons throughout history that people would do those, and he says, don't do any of that. Have nothing to do with it. He goes on, he says, do not profane your daughter by making her a harlot, so that the land will not fall into harlotry, and the land become full of lewdness. You shall keep my Sabbath and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Both of these have to do with keeping special things special. The Sabbath, keeping it special. Your daughter, keeping her special and not profaning them. Do not turn to mediums or spiritualists or spiritists. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. mediums and spiritists, people who would try to talk to the dead or to talk to spirits, and they were forbidden from doing that. Now, someone might say, well, come on, my body, my choice. Shouldn't the person decide how they want to practice their own spirituality? Someone wants to decide, I'm going to make tattoos, then I should be allowed to do that. Someone might say, well, I want to try to use a medium and do a seance. I should be allowed to do that. So how are these restrictions for your good, or for their good? Well, each of these things is part of idolatrous practices, and God wanted his people to be devoted to him alone. Be devoted to God. Trust God. Don't get involved in any of those idolatrous practices. Now, as a side note, almost immediately what do we see them doing? We see them getting involved in idolatrous practices. And every single time, it resulted in negative things happening. Idolatrous practices never turned out well for the people of Israel. Leviticus 19:32 through 37, we see some restrictions on attitude towards others. Starting in 32, you shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall revere your God, I am the Lord. So showing honor and respect to the elderly, standing up when they go past, giving them honor. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So not mistreating visitors to the area, not treating them as second-rate persons. You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measurement of weight or capacity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall thus observe all my statutes and all my ordinances, and do them. I am the Lord. So, having just weights and measures, being honest in your business dealings. Now again, someone might say, oh, come on, but I think respect and kindness need to be earned, not freely given. Again, I've been told this by people who claim to follow the Bible. Respect needs to be earned. I'm not going to give it freely. Well, this section says to give honor to the gray-headed. Doesn't matter, it didn't say if they deserve it. It says to not mistreat the foreigner. Doesn't say if they deserve it, etc. So how are these restrictions for their good? Well, quite frankly, kindness and respect increase the overall well-being of a society. You look at a society that teaches respect, and their quality of life is much higher than a society that does not teach personal respect. But also, and I think more importantly, a person's attitude towards others reflects their attitude towards God. If people are made in the image of God, and we're mistreating that which is made in the image of God, what does that say about our attitude towards God? Now, of course, this was referring to the Jews particularly, but there's a lesson in there that could be gleaned for us today. So we see chapter 19 has a wide scattering of various different laws, all of which are for the betterment of really the entire community, restricting individuals' actions, but for the protection of others. Now let's go to Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, and we're going to see some more really very interesting restrictions that God put on the Jewish people. Verses 1 through 22, we're not going to read the whole thing, but it talks about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. See, every seventh year, they were to let the land rest. This was a Sabbath year. So what that meant is that for 6 years, they would till the soil, plant their seed, harvest their crops. But that seventh year, they were not to plow the fields. They weren't to plant any seed. They were just to let the ground do whatever it did. And God promised them if they did that, the land would produce enough bountiful fruit that it would sustain them. But they were supposed to let the land rest. And then every 49th year, that's 7 sets of 7 years, land ownership reverted to the ancestral owners and slaves were set free. Now what that meant, remember, when the Jews conquered the land of Canaan, God had them split up the land based on the tribes, and then the tribal lands were split up among the families by a casting of lots. And that chunk of land that your family was given was to be your family's chunk of land for the rest of the nation, the rest of the time. But sometimes people get poor. The land would get sold. And so every 49 years, the land would go back to the families that it was originally given to. Also, slaves were to be set free. Now, the next few verses deal with that in more detail. Leviticus 25, 23 through 34 talk more specifically about the restrictions on the land ownership and land prices. Let's look at this. 25, starting in verse 23. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and you are but aliens and sojourners with me. Now, isn't that interesting? You don't own the land. It's God's land. He's just letting you hang out there, right? That's a good thing for all of us to remember. Everything is God's. He just lets us use it. Thus, for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. Okay, what's that mean? Well, he explains it. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. So you make some poor business choices. You become poor and you have to sell off a chunk of your land. Well, your closest kinsman, maybe your cousin, your uncle, whatever, they come and they pay for that to keep that in the family. Or, in the case of a man who has no kinsman, but so recovers his means so as to find sufficient for its redemption. So you became poor, but you got back up, you made some better decisions, you got your money back. Then he shall calculate the years since its sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and so return to his property. So we have here a restriction on the price. The landowner, the new landowner, couldn't just say, hey, I want this outrageous number. You had to have a particular calculation for it. But if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, then when he has sold, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at the Jubilee it shall revert so that he may return to his property. So that 49th year, the land goes back. Now the rest of it goes on and talks about what to do about a house in a walled city and a house in a village that doesn't have a wall, and the land of the Levites and the house of a Levite. But someone might look at these laws, especially someone who's into real estate and finance these days, and might say, well, come on, a land baron would never be able to build a fortune under that system. If the person can redeem it back at this set price and every 49 years it goes back to them, well, okay, how are these for your good or for their good? Well, they ensure that each generation had the opportunity to support themselves. And you think about how neat of a system that would be for the Jewish people. Say your father made some bad business decisions and he lost all of his land. Not your fault. That was his fault. Well, on that 49th year, this is basically once per generation, you get the land back. You get the opportunity to make better decisions than your father did. Each generation has that opportunity to support themselves. That's a really neat system that God set up for the Jews in that time. Verses 35 through 55 talk about restrictions on the treatment of poor countrymen. Let's look at this some. 35 through 55. We're not going to read the whole entire thing, but starting in 35. Now, in the case of a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Do not take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. Okay, what is usurious interest? That would mean that you can't say, hey, yeah, I'll give you money, but I'm going to charge it to you at 50% interest, compounded daily, right? You just give him what he needs to support himself. He goes on and he says, you shall not give him your silver at interest or your food for gain. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and be your God. Again, everything belongs to God in the first place. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, and he may remain in his property of his forefathers. So this person is allowed to go free on that year of Jubilee. Now, it goes on and it talks more about different situations. We're going to skip forward to verse 47. Now, if the means of a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him that he sells himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or the descendant of a stranger's family. So this is not a Israelite, but a Israelite ends up selling themselves to a foreigner. Then he shall have redemption rights after he's been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him. The one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. So a family member could come and buy him out of slavery, or he could work and gain the money to buy himself out of that. And it goes on and talks more about these things. All of these dealing with the treatment of various people in various situations of being poor. Now, someone might look at these and say, well, they probably got themselves into that situation. They should get themselves out of it. You know, it's not my fault that they got themselves there. And that may be a tempting point of view. So how are these restrictions for your good or for their good? Well, they ensure that the poor are cared for and have the opportunity to get out of poverty. Talk about an equal opportunity situation. They all had the opportunity to get out of that poverty. And if they had a close family member who could get them out of that situation, then all the better. Now, we could go on and talk more and more about these social and personal laws. But for the sake of time, we're going to stop here. As we've been looking at this, the social and personal laws, we've seen that these laws were put in place. Yes, they restricted people's freedoms, but they did so to protect others for the betterment of not just the individual, but the community at large. See, God never gives arbitrary rules. There's always a reason why those rules exist. And this is going to become very important when we get to the New Testament and see that even though there may be laws in the New Testament that we may not necessarily even like, they are there for a reason. So as you study, my friends, as you study, consider the positive impact that God's restrictions would have on the community as a whole. And this is a bit of a shift in mentality. It's really easy to look at the Bible and say, well, that's going to restrict me. How is this going to affect me? And how can I get out of it? But think about, as you follow the instructions that God gave in the New Testament, what positive impact is that going to have on those around you? Now that puts it in a different light. And we're going to see in a few weeks that each of the instructions he's given us in the New Testament, they benefit not just us, but those around us. Now today, as we are going into our time of invitation, you might have a need. Maybe there's some sin in your life that you need to repent of. Maybe there's a difficult time that you're going through and you need the prayers of the congregation. We want to be here for you. When we have that song, I encourage you, come up to the front. One of the elders will come speak with you. And if you're not yet a Christian, maybe you want to learn more about how to become a Christian. Maybe you're ready to become a Christian. You're ready to be baptized into Christ. We want to be here for you. We want to help you. So if you have a need, whatever it may be, please let it be known as Bob leads us in this invitation song.